Welcome, everybody. Thank you. We're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, and maybe one of the more rebellious topics, which is kind of a trend that we're doing. So, of course, I invited Joe O'Connor and Jay Goldman to talk about their experience kind of shaking things up the past, many years, and some of their experience. And we're going to be talking about the 4-day work week. Joe, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in this? You don't have to do the traditional 90-second intro if you want to give a little bit more background, because it is a really interesting story from both of you.
Sure. Well, I'm Irish, so I know quite a bit about rebellion. I think it's kind of it's something that we all have in our blood to some extent. So I got interested in this topic about 5 years ago. I was leading a research project in Ireland on work-life balance in the Irish public service. And we found that we had a lot of working parents, mostly women, who were working reduced hour work weeks voluntarily, but they were doing it for a reduction in salary. But when we looked into it, we found that often these people were actually producing the same output. They had the same expectations in their jobs. So that got me really fascinated with this whole area of, is there an opportunity to declutter and to optimize the work week and to share some of those efficiency benefits with employees. And that led me to the 4-day work week, and have been spending most of the last number of years of my career leading global trials on this issue and supporting organizations to make the switch to a shorter work week.
Amazing. And you've actually worked with Jay.
Yeah. That is right.
So Jay, do you want to give, I love your story, give a little bit of the longer how you got here. And I think I put it the last time we spoke, who the fuck do you think you are? Jay, if you don't know, Jay kind of moonlights as a tech mogul and working for a big tech company, but has lots of other initiatives and rebellion in that way.
Yeah, I don't know that we're a big tech company. I think we're a quite small tech company, but yeah. This has been a long journey. We are actually, the company I lead today, Sensei Labs, is a spin out from a company called Click Health. Click with a K. Click is a commercialization partner for life science companies, so in the biotech and pharma space. And Click was founded in 1997 and has always been very focused on talent and culture and building an environment in which people can do the best work of their career. And so that has always led us to reconsider some of the kind of accepted wisdom of how you should run a company, how you should make decisions, who you should hire, all of those kind of critical questions and decision points about who you put on the bus, to use the classic expression. And so we were always sort of open to experimentation and open to new ideas, particularly as it came to how we structure the business and how we encourage people to get engaged and to do their work. And I had the good fortune to hear Dr. Juliet Shore speak about the 4-day week. She's an economist from Boston College and was actually working with Joe and the 4-day week organization to study the economic benefits of 4-day week. And her talk happened at a very convenient time for Sensei Labs, because we were starting to think about how do we actually compete with those big tech companies. They can pay significantly more than we can, but there's lots of people who don't really want to work for a big tech company. And so that puts those people in a bit of a quandary. Do I take a higher salary and maybe do a job I don't love? Or do I work for a startup and do something I'm passionate about, but maybe can't get as much compensation for? And so we were thinking about that, kind of going back to first principles. How do we go back and rethink what total compensation looks like? Maybe we can't pay as much, but can we do other things that have significant benefits? And so Dr. Shore's talk happened at a very convenient moment in that conversation. And I thought, I don't think big tech companies are going to switch to a 4-day week anytime soon, but maybe that's something we can consider doing. And maybe that brings lots of benefits to our team in terms of mental health and in terms of work-life balance, but also brings an element into that equation of total compensation that changes the conversation from being just about dollars. And so I brought that back to my leadership team from the talk. And in our spirit of experimentation, we decided to participate in the global trial that the 4-day week global organization was running. So we enrolled in the trial. We had about 2 months of prep time working with Joe and the team there to rethink our processes, look at our calendars, take out meetings that we didn't need, really find that 20% efficiency or productivity boost that would enable us to then adopt the pilot. We participated in the 6-month pilot quite successfully, learned lots of lessons, which we can dig into and understand a little better. And happy to say that we have continued to be a 4-day week company. And we have committed with our team that we will look at that every 6 months and continue to do so as long as we are able to be productive as a team and as long as we continue to see benefits from it.
Amazing. And did you see when you kind of initiated the 4-day week, did you see that change your war for talent? Did you see people, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so Joe can speak to some of the results that have come out of the pilots in terms of what they have found across the board. But I can tell you for our team, we have asked the question, how much percentage-wise would you need to see in an increase in salary to go work for a 5-day week company? And the answer varies on our team, averages about 30%, and we've had people say as much as 50%. So you're talking about taking a really significant pay increase in order to be able to get to a 5-day week. So it has a really big impact on people. We've had people tell us that some of our team members have actually said they just would never go back to a 5-day week company. It didn't matter what the compensation offer was. I don't know that that is a universal truth, but I have heard it from some team members. But we've also had people tell us it's completely changed their lives to have a 4-day week instead of a 5-day week. We've had parents of young kids talk about how they used to spend their Sundays afternoon and evening getting ready for their week ahead, and that meant that they had less family time on the weekend. So they now spend some of their Friday getting ready for the next week. And although that means they are working a 5th day, they were already working a 6th day if they were doing that on Sunday. And so now they do some of that on Friday, and then they get an entire weekend with their family. And that's made a big difference to their home life, to their family interactions. We've had people use that day to take courses, to do things they've always wanted to do but could never fit into their schedule, pick up hobbies. And so it has made a pretty significant difference to the lives of our senseis, which ultimately, beyond an economic argument, is worth doing on its own. But it has also certainly lowered what was already a pretty low attrition rate to a very low attrition rate. And I think has attracted talent to come and work here who maybe wouldn't have looked at us or wouldn't have given us as serious a consideration without that as part of the total compensation package.
Wow. Okay, Joe, can you give us a bigger insight on who is maybe more attracted to the 4-day? Is it everyone equally? Is it more like you were talking about women? Do you have better diversity options or talent that's coming in? If you are offering the 4-day work week, who wants it the most? who seems to be chasing it in that way?
Well, I think from an employee perspective, our collective experience during COVID has probably meant that for most people, we place a greater value and a greater priority on time than maybe has been the case in society for a number of generations. I think if you look at the data, the demand for this probably skews a little bit towards younger workers. So we're definitely seeing Gen Z, we're really valuing things like experiences, sustainability. And also it probably skews a little bit female as well. I think for organizations, the demand is, it is true to say that the vast majority of organizations are white collar, desk-based type jobs that we've seen to date. That doesn't mean that we haven't seen it work in other settings. We shared yesterday, Lamborghini have just introduced this for their production workers in Italy. There's been a series of manufacturing success stories over the last number of years. So I think that the demand side is probably linked to the fact that, just like over 100 years ago, manufacturing kind of led the charge because that's where the power base and the power dynamics in the economy were. We're probably seeing it coming more from knowledge work. But we do think that there's going to be opportunities, in much more diverse sectors of the economy to make this switch too.
Okay. Amazing. Yeah, I didn't know if I was the target market or if it just sounded really good to me. one of the things that Jay mentioned, which I think is really interesting, was this idea of, removing 20%, or both of you talked about removing 20% of the waste. And then this idea of how many days we actually work, because there, we kind of, I don't know. I don't even know how much I work. Most people say, we're connecting and we're communicating and we're busy all the time, but we're doing less actual, kind of the usual things that we think of as work. So how many days a week do people work? How much do we spend where is this? I'm just going to leave that with you. where is this? Where is this actually when we look at it? So we're removing a day. Do we go to actually 4 days? Do we go to then 5 days because we've all been working on the weekends? Are we removing waste so that we can do more work? What do you guys think?
It's a question of a day's work is maybe the wrong unit to look at. So if you are spending a weekend, maybe you're out with your partner and you look at your phone and you've got an important Slack or Teams message, and so you reply to it and you spend 5 minutes. Have you now counted that as a day of work or not a day of work? And I think that membrane is much more permeable than it ever has been just because of the technology in our pockets. So I'm not sure that a day's work is any more really the right metric to use. We expect our team to be present and working for 4 days a week. For us, it's Monday to Thursday for the whole team. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things that come up outside of that. We have customers around the world, so we have 24-hour support for our team. We also have customers who work on Fridays, so there are sometimes requests that come in and our teams have to kind of figure out how to cover those requests and that work that comes in, even if it happens obviously on a Friday. So I think the unit of work is probably not a day, but if we think of it as maybe a total percentage of a person's time, even if it's split up in different ways or happens in shifted fashion across their total week, that's probably a better way to sort of think about it. And for us, it was, can you find 20% efficiency in what you do today? And I think of it as the 2 months that we spent preparing for the trial or the pilot was extremely valuable, excuse me, for our organization, actually regardless of the pilot outcome, because it forced us to pressurize all of our systems in a way that helped to identify leaks and inefficiencies, and with a very strong reward at the end of that. So if you just went to your team and said, all right, I want everyone to be 20% more efficient, you'd get like, yeah, okay, let me see what I can do. Maybe I'll think about it. And you wouldn't get very far. If you go to people and say, I want everyone to be 20% more efficient, but if you manage to do that, you get your Fridays off, it becomes a very powerful incentive to find those 20% efficiencies. And because we have adopted a model that says every 6 months, we'll look at this again, and provided we're still seeing the right outcomes, we'll keep it. It remains a powerful efficiency motivator. It remains a reason for people to continue to make sure that we find those 20% efficiencies and we keep them in place.
Yeah.
So can you talk to, sorry, and I was just going to ask, how easy is it to find that 20%? And do you have any extreme fun stories or examples to share on that? Naming no names, of course.
Let me start with the first half of the question and see where I end up. I think I don't want the takeaway from this to be that this is kind of an easy thing. This is not a magic bullet. This is not something that, you move to a shorter work week, you reduce people's work time by 20%, and there's these kind of magic productivity gains. This is something that requires a lift on behalf of everyone in the organization in the way that Jay has described. There's a real commitment required to work redesign, to operational excellence. I think one of the most striking takeaways from the trial results for me was the fact that we surveyed employees about their work intensity, so their pace of work. How do they feel in terms of the speed at which they were having to perform work? And that actually reduced by 2% for those people who moved from a 5-day to a 4-day work week, which seems, very counterintuitive that you're kind of asking people to produce the same amount in less time. And I think that really shows that this wasn't about taking the same work that they were doing and cramming it into 4 days. It was about really rethinking, what are the things that are really important? Where are the opportunities to find efficiencies? Where might there be, innovative ways to to automate, opportunities to unlock potential. So I think Jay's right. There's often a psychological dimension to this which is overlooked, which is the fact that, fine, if you want to take an attitude that if we all agree that there's 15, 20, 25% of wiggle room within modern work, and I'm just going to do that, by demanding people to find it, the likelihood that you're going to realize those kinds of gains in the way that organizations who have given people this really powerful engagement tool and incentive, I think is very unlikely,
Yeah, I think that kind of leans into this idea of breaking cycles, because we have all been working like this our whole lives. We've seen our parents work like this, our grandparents, we came from industrialization. Before then we had farming. We're used to working all day, most days of the week, if not all days of the week. When you talk about breaking in, and I think you did something really great with Jay's company where you kind of went to the management board and you said what you do on that first day off is paramount of the importance and that example. So can you talk a little bit about that first day and what that looked like?
Yeah, we're strong believers in people look up towards the leadership team. And if you don't model the behavior that you want your team to see, then it doesn't matter what words you say, because they won't do the thing that you want. We used to work with a company that said in summer, everyone can take Fridays off. And then the management team all showed up at the office on Fridays and kept sending email. So no one took Fridays off, because you're not going to take a Friday off knowing that the leadership team is in the office working. That just looks bad. And so you ignore the fact that they said you could take Fridays and you show up. And so we knew that if we wanted this to really be something that people believed in, we were going to have to show them that we were serious about this. And so we modeled that behavior by making sure that on the first Friday of the trial, we as a leadership team all really did take the day off. We didn't send any Teams messages or any emails. And then I asked all of our leaders on the following Monday to share some pictures and a little story about what they did with their Friday. And that sort of forced them to maybe do more than they would have otherwise done with it. I mean, it's your day off. If you want to spend it sleeping in and playing video games, that's totally up to you. But I asked them maybe for this one to, make an effort to do something a bit more meaningful with it and then share some pictures from it. And we got some great pictures. People went to, the park and they went for a walk with their dog and they took their kid out for lunch at school, and they did all kinds of things that they probably would not have done otherwise, and then shared pictures of it. And that really made it safe and created that psychological safety for our team to know that we were serious about this and we really do want them to do that.
Amazing. And Joe, how did they do?
Well, from what I can tell, they're doing great. They're still sticking with it, which I think is one of the big determinants of success. And the truth is that the vast majority of companies that trial this end up sticking with it. There's some self-selecting bias in that, because I think the types of leaders and the types of organizations that are attracted to this are typically culturally a good fit. They're typically prepared to put in the hard yards operationally in the way that Jay has described. But I think we're past the point now where there's a question as to whether this can be achieved. I think it's been demonstrated now in enough different types of organizations of different shapes and sizes that this is an operating model that can work for a lot of different businesses. And I think where we've moved on to now is the how. And we produced a research paper last week, which was really intending to answer that question of what are the key success criteria to making a shorter work week work? What are the kind of unique characteristics that unify companies like Jay's and all of the other companies that have made a success of this? I think one of the key components of it is, this is less of a trade of kind of time for money. So this isn't about reducing time, cutting salaries. This isn't about, cramming the same amount of work into less time. It's a trade of kind of trust and autonomy. So providing people with that challenge that they need to rise to, but in exchange, there's an elevated performance accountability, I think, in these organizations. There needs to be a maturity that if we're going to be offered this, really life-changing, transformative, powerful benefit, when, we are living in a world where most of Jay's competitors, most of Jay's clients, most of the stakeholders he deals with are not working 4-day work weeks. So, in return, there is an elevated expectation that, and I think that actually materializes itself often, not just in terms of the metrics that you're using to track success, but I think there's probably a healthy peer pressure involved there. There's an expectation within teams that, people are getting this incredible gift, and everyone needs to step up to the plate to make sure that, every 6 months when Jay and his team look at this is still working for the company and it's still sustainable.
Love that. So I wanted to do a little competition, because I think one of the best ways that we learn is through what not to do. So I'm hoping that I'm going to give one of you the assignment to say, like, how do we screw up the 4-day work week? Like, what is the worst case scenario where you create the, or how do you screw that up? Worst place to work ever, total failure. And then on the other side, how do you really bring this home? And I think we should switch roles. I think Joe should, or who wants to do the worst case scenario, and who wants to?
I'm definitely up for doing the worst case. Yeah.
you.
All right. Sure.
Okay.
I would say the first thing is you do no planning and preparation. And I've seen organizations actually that have done this with no planning and have eventually made it work. But by God, was it a bumpy, chaotic transition? There was months of friction and kind of building the aircraft while it's in flight. And every company needs to do some extent of that. But I think if you're very intentional and deliberate in the planning process, you can save yourself a lot of unnecessary pain. I would say the other what not to do is, basically the C-suite sitting around the executive table and figuring out, here's all the changes we need to make within the business in order to make this successful, and then just kind of handing that off to the team, because, you're not going to get that. You're not going to get the same innovation, because the people who know where the inefficiencies are hiding are the people that are doing the work day to day. And then even if you get some kind of short-term benefits out of that, it's not going to be as sticky as it would be if people are kind of empowered with figuring out how to make this work themselves. So I'd say that's a second, just do not do it. And maybe a third and final one is, it needs to be very transparent what is expected of people. What does success look like for the business, and how are we measuring that? One of the biggest fears that leaders have about trying this is, what if we try it and it doesn't work? And, if we have to go back, won't that create resentment? Won't people be pissed off? And that is true to some extent. I think that this is something that is so valuable that if you take it away, of course, people aren't going to feel great about that. But I think you can mitigate that to a very significant extent if people know exactly what's required of them. I think the worst possible thing you can do is have a situation where people are trialing this, they think it's going well, and all of a sudden there's this kind of, hey presto announcement, actually, you know what, this isn't working. So that needs to be very, very clear and transparent to people.
Is there ever a risk that you can have half of the organization go to 4 days a week and or part of it not? Or you have some people who lean in and say, this is great, I'm not going to work on Fridays, and then others who kind of keep, and then you sort of have two mix math, you know what I'm saying?
I think the trouble for that is that most of the efficiency gains that we're talking about lie in systems change rather than individual productivity change. Sure, every individual can find ways to become, to optimize their own individual productivity. But unless there's a team-based approach to meetings, to collaboration, to processes, then, I don't believe that there's 20% of inefficiency lying just in individual level inefficiency. So this does need to be a collective effort. And we've seen organizations where, employees have left because they would prefer to coast through a 5-day work week with a different company than have the elevated scrutiny that comes attached with working a 4-day work week.
Wow. Okay. All right. Now to the ideal. And Jay, you did an amazing transition to the 4-day week. You're also one of the co-authors of the Decoded Company, which I really enjoyed and very much recommend. Although
Thank you.
And one of my favorite things was you said that part of this was you and your co-author has a deep hatred for email, and that's part of what motivates you to write this book that kind of inspired. And considering that you wrote it a few years ago has come true in a lot of ways, and that must
Yeah,
be
it's
fun.
actually the 10th anniversary of the book in February.
And there are things that are scary in there where you guys really had it on the nose. So that's yeah, well done. So
Thank you. It's great when you can be accurate. Like, we didn't know 10 years ago when we were writing it. It's really nice looking back that we were right about some of it, but it's also kind of scary that we were right about some of it. It took a lot longer than we had sort of hoped. But yeah, a lot of the work that we were doing a decade ago at Click was around how do we communicate better as a team without using email as the basis for that. Today, I think people have seen a reduction in their email volume because it's moved into things like Slack and Teams. Better or worse, I don't know, but maybe a reduction. I can tell you that as an organization, we don't use any email except with outside of the company. So there's no email communication inside of Sensei Labs.
Wow, amazing. Okay, well then over to you and your forecasting. So maybe a little forecasting in this too. How do you succeed? But then where is this going in the future?
I think we did a good job on setting up our pilot. And so I would say if you're going to do this, ideally, don't skimp on the setup time. Joe made, I think, the same point in reverse of the worst and bumpiest journeys have been the ones that didn't do the planning. The most difficult thing for us in that pilot was establishing what productivity metrics would look like for different teams. And there is a bit of art to this, probably almost more art than science when it comes to this. It is a very difficult thing to do. Not every job is measurable directly in the same way. And you end up with, and we asked our teams to establish their own productivity metrics, and we had to push back on some of them because they weren't real productivity metrics. It's easy here to end up with so-called vanity metrics where it is a metric and it's measurable, but it's also very easy to game and make it look good. And so, if you say to a team, if you hit your productivity targets, you can keep a 4-day week, and then they make up productivity targets that aren't that hard to hit, you haven't accomplished anything. So I would say going into that journey, if someone who is listening is thinking about this for your organization, really spend some time thinking about how you measure productivity. And I would encourage you to focus on thinking about outputs, not inputs. So that, and by that, I mean, the number of hours you put into something isn't what actually matters. It's what comes out the other end of that process that really matters. And so a lot of productivity metrics end up being inputs because we find it harder to measure the outputs, or measuring the outputs creates strange feedback loops. So if you have an engineering team and you say to your engineering team, okay, we are going to measure productivity as the number of lines of code that you write. That is a terrible productivity metric for engineering teams because it encourages them to write longer code, which is not what you want as a result. If you say to them, we're going to measure it by the number of defects per 100 lines of code written, then they will not write less defective code because that's just a limitation of how software development works, but they will find ways to not report the defects that are in there. And so you haven't actually accomplished what you're looking for either. So I will say we didn't master this. I think it's a very difficult thing to do, but I would spend time with each of your teams and think about how to effectively measure that productivity. The second lesson for us was, how do you solve for things like how to have coverage when you need to be available to customers, but nobody's working? So we took an initial pass at this where we asked all of our teams to set their own schedule. We said it can only be Mondays or Fridays because we didn't want some teams unavailable on Tuesdays and others on Thursdays and whatever. And so the first pass at this for us had some teams available, some teams not working Mondays, some teams not working Wednesdays, and some teams split it up so that there were coverage. Sorry, Mondays and Fridays. The lesson here is that this is a big experiment, and you have to undertake things for your organization in a very experimental mindset, because we went into this saying, we're going to try some stuff here, and some of it's going to stick and some of it isn't, but we need to be able to pivot during this trial. So we're not going to hold true to proper scientific principle here and say, we have to wait till the end of the 6 months before we vary the experiment, or we won't know whether we changed the hypothesis or we invalidated some of our experimental measures. That doesn't make sense for a business that has to operate. And so we said to our team at the start of this is going to be a 6-month experiment. And in that experiment, we're going to keep making changes as we need to make them. And so in that spirit, we realized probably about halfway through, that by having some team members on Mondays and some people on Fridays, we had inadvertently created a 3-day collaborative week. So what I mean by that is, if you're on a 5-day week company, you have 5 days to collaborate across teams. If you go down to a 4-day week company, you clearly have 4 days to collaborate. But if some people have a different day off, you actually only have 3 days to collaborate, which meant anything that went across teams could only happen Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And that was a limitation that was being felt in the organization. So we went back to everybody and said, this isn't working with people taking different days. Everybody's going to move to Friday. Teams will have to figure out their own way of approaching coverage. And that's varied on some of our teams. On our customer success team, who works most closely with our customers, they have invented a schedule and it works very well for them. We're basically every 5 weeks, because of the size of that team, you will be on call for that Friday. You don't have to work the whole thing, but you do have to check in the morning, at noon, and in the end of the day. And anything that gets escalated by a customer during the in-between times will get sent to that team. We've put some technology systems in place to provide that coverage. On our engineering teams, we have a larger team there. So I think it works out to every 7 or 8 weeks. You're on call. You don't have to do anything other than be not further than 10 minutes away from an internet connection and a keyboard. So you can do whatever you want with your day. You just can't be further away, because if something was to go wrong, we would need you to step in and obviously be able to fix that. And so that's worked well for that as well. So I would encourage you, as you're thinking about your schedules, experiment and see what works for you. And don't be afraid to say to people, you are getting an incredible bonus in your life by having all these extra days. I'm going to need you a few times a year to be available on that day, just in case we need you and something goes wrong.
Amazing.
So those were big lessons that we learned. And I think I wouldn't go back and implement this differently. I think we took the right approach. And I think those lessons were important lessons to learn. I'm not sure we could have learned them up front for our own organization. And that's sort of how we look at all best practices that we're implementing. A best practice that someone else has gone through the trial and error on, developed into a best practice, written it up, it's got enough traction to have crossed your LinkedIn feed or whatever, is probably 5 or 6 years old by the time you get that piece of wisdom. And it's coming out of a completely different culture and organization. So to take it wholesale and try to just drop it into your business, it's very unlikely to succeed. But to take it as, this is an interesting experiment, let's figure out how we make this our own and how it adapts to our culture and our values and our ways of working, means you can much more successfully take that on. And 4-day week is no different than any other idea that might come across your feed, or a friend might tell you about. You might see a TED talk on it. Whatever that may be, this gives you an opportunity to take it and make it your own.
I love that. I think that trial and error is so, and we talk about that all the time, kind of this idea of the importance of experimentation and the importance of failed experiments, because you can learn a lot there. And okay, so then your second assignment for both of you, I'm going to add it for both, but what do we see as the future of this? Because I think people think of the 4-day week as this kind of this benefit or this kind of luxury thing for companies that either are fighting the war for talent or have enough resources and want to make a nicer work environment for everyone. Where is this going? Let's start with Joe.
I'm going to talk about this as a model, and I'm going to talk about this as a movement, because it is effectively both. This is something that we've seen a huge amount of traction and support for as a concept, in broader society, but it's also one of a suite of options that's now available to HR leaders as they think about what's the right operating model for my business. I think as a model, it is inevitable that we're going to see a growth and adoption of this from a low base. It was even lower pre-COVID. It's still low now. It's much more common, but it's still a niche endeavor. And it's the reason why for most firms like Jay, they're typically one of the only firms within their industry that's offering this, which kind of elevates the benefit as an early adapter. I think we're going to see more and more companies doing this based on the evidence that's clearly out there that this is something that, if designed properly, can work for a whole load of businesses and deliver a whole load of benefits. I think that's then going to lead to a kind of fast follower situation where there are going to be organizations within those industries that kind of see their competitors doing this successfully and feel that, we're not able to pay top dollar, maybe we either can't or won't offer full work from home flexibility. So this is one option that we can use to stay competitive. So I think we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years that this is going to be a bigger piece of the puzzle and a bigger part of the pie than it is today. I think that's inevitable. I think the big kind of question mark on the movement side is, are we going to get to a situation in a decade that this is the new standards, that this is the new equivalent of today's 5-day 9 to 5? And I think it comes down to, for me, AI is the big enabler. If that's going to happen, AI is the thing that can make it happen. And I've no question that, the technology will provide us with the productive capacity to do this en masse. But we've already seen technologies like the internet, like email, like the globalization of trade, all of these different things happening in recent decades, and they haven't been used to reduce the work week. They've been used to create space for more work. So I feel like, whether that actually happens or not is really up to us as a collective economy, society, and so on. And maybe if it's going to be different this time, maybe it is the climate and sustainability question. Maybe it is the fact that we have, this kind of ESG world that we're living in, that maybe, the productivity gains that come from AI, banking all of those against increased consumption is not the route that we travel. But I think the jury is out on that one, and it's one that we all need to watch closely.
Yeah, Bill Gates just recently said that his vision of the path of AI is that we get to a 3-day work week. And the rest of that productivity is handled by AI, and he's obviously a very smart person who knows what he's talking about. So it's certainly a possible future that we're headed towards. We're seeing this play out on the backdrop of the post-pandemic hybrid return to office push, and probably no surprise given the conversation that we've had. We didn't push our teams back to office. I'm in our office today, and I'm in most days with our sales team who are in office. But most of our team is hybrid and might come in once a week, or in some cases they live further from our office. They may never come in, or they might come in once a month. And that's not affected our ability to be productive, I think, with maybe one exception to that, which is there is still just no substitute for getting a group of people together in a room with a whiteboard and being able to focus on a problem and work on it. And that's, we opened our office during the pandemic. So this office opened in September 2021. And when we opened it, the first principal question we were trying to solve was, how do we create a collaboration space for our team for in-person? So that was what they were looking for. They wanted to have a space where they could get together as a team. And at that time, since it was still during the pandemic, it was very much sort of like, can we come in this week, or is the office closed? Now it's, open and people can come in. But the problem that we were trying to solve for was that in-person collaboration question. And it's still very much what the office gets used for today. People come in and the team will take a room and they'll spend a few hours together and they'll work through some problems that they just wouldn't have been as effective at working through if they were all on a Teams call or all working remotely or asynchronously on it. And so there's so many changes happening. It's hard to know which ones will end up being the ones that change the landscape. But I think it's safe to say we're not going back to a 5-day in-office world of work. Whether that ends up being majority of companies shift towards a 4-day schedule, or even if Bill Gates is correct, a 3-day schedule, and it's supplemented by AI, whether it's in person or mostly hybrid or remote, I think the jury's still out. And, 5-10 years is a long time. If I'd asked you 5 or 10 years ago, you probably wouldn't have predicted COVID. So, that can have a big impact on things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also a great mention that you guys are both in the city of Toronto, a city that is a beautiful, big, vibrant city, but also has traffic jams like Jay encountered today, and different things about coming and commuting to the office. Thank you guys so much for joining the podcast. I think I'm going to leave it at that. I had a scholar speak at a conference, I think we were all at it, where he said, AI is not going to take your job. Someone using AI is going to take your job. But it's great if we do indeed actually use technology to reduce our workload and do things that human beings are even better at than menial tasks or checking things for accuracy, for example. So I think that's quite exciting and leads into...
We're leaning into just as we think about AI and how it changes our business, we are leaning into AI is not coming for your job, it's coming to your job.
Love that. All right. Well, we will attach their names and info in LinkedIn with all of this so you guys can get in touch with Joe and Jay and learn more about the amazing work that they do, both moonlighting and the real stuff. But thank you guys so much. It's always a pleasure, and love talking about this topic with you. Thank you.